It's a whole year since Under the Lake first aired. Watch on to find out why I love it so much. So I've now reviewed the first two episodes of Series 9, the opener. Please go and check out those reviews if you haven't already. And I'm now on to the first part of Series 9's second two-parter, Under the Lake. So without further ado, let's get on to what I think of it. Now, I found the pre-titles very interesting and very creepy. It introduces the concept of the ghost, and also the characters of the crew, very well. It's quite horror movie-esque, I think. It has that kind of lonely, chilling feeling. Again, the titles were not in sync, just like in The Magician's Apprentice, and numerous times in Series 8, which actually really annoyed me this time. Now that I'm actively looking out for it every time I watch or rewatch a Capaldio episode, it's actually really getting on my nerves, and they just need to sort it out in Series 10. But anyway, I found it original how we didn't see the TARDIS land. Well, when we first meet the Doctor and Clara, well, it's just the Doctor at first, the TARDIS has already landed, and he's leaning against the wall of the TARDIS, asking it questions, and asking it why it's brought him here. So I found that quite unique, quite original, because obviously in most stories, we either see the TARDIS land, and then the companion and the Doctor walk out, or we start with a group of people, like a group of crew members, and the Doctor and Clara just suddenly walk into the room and say, hello, we're the Doctor and Clara. So I enjoyed that. Looking back, this is probably the Series 9 story which explores Clara's obsession and recklessness the most, I think. It's not really very subtle, you know, the viewer doesn't have to really work very hard to work out that there is something wrong here, and Clara is taking her obsession with travelling with the Doctor a bit too far, even at this early stage, and of course this foreshadows the events of Face the Raven, leading to Clara's eventual demise. I found the crew members of the Drum very likeable, and it's definitely one of the best crews we've had in New Who overall, I think. It's reminiscent of stories such as the Ganger two-parter in Series 6, or the Ood two-parter in Series 2, where we had groups of people that were quite likeable, groups made up of people that could almost be companions, but will never be because they're committed to their work or lives already. So I enjoyed the crew members, apart from Pritchard, but of course we're meant to completely hate Pritchard. I mean, what a prat. He is such an idiot and really, really irritating. He just gets on your nerves, going on about his company and assets and things like that. And it's interesting actually how he's the first crew member to be killed off and subsequently turned into a ghost on screen. But I will get onto that later because I've got a bit more to say about that further on in my notes. I love the inclusion of Cass. It gives the show a new, fresh opportunity to feature a disabled character and explore their perspective and how they kind of shake up the chemistry of the other characters and the situations they're put in. And then obviously off screen as well, it's a good move for diversity on television. So yes, I'm a big fan of Cass, and I think it's great that the writers and producers aren't afraid to write strong roles for these characters that would otherwise have very small roles in episodes. Because Cass is the leader of the group now that Moran has gone, so it gives her even more responsibility and makes things even more interesting because she's got to lead the group, and it's definitely something we've not seen before. The Doctor has some great one-liners early on. For instance, anyone got a peanut allergy and stuff like that. The line about Shirley Bassey as well. Some very funny lines in quite a dark, or at least the setup for some very dark events later on. Another one of these that links back to Pritchard is, sorry, why is this man still talking to me? I found that absolutely hilarious on rewatch, and probably on initial watch as well. I just love it when 12 does stuff like that. It's rude in a way, but also so frank and brutally honest. And he's kind of pointing out what everybody watching thinks of this stupid man. I thought there was some great attention to detail by having Lunn signing for Cass in the background of scenes, for instance when the Doctor is talking, and he's just there in the background doing the sign language for her. I think that must have been quite complex to film and arrange and set up. And I think it's a real testament to the production team that they managed to get that done and added in that extra detail, which could easily have been missed out in any other show. I think we probably take it a bit for granted, but I really appreciated it on this rewatch. I'm not sure I like the idea of the Doctor not being able to read sign language, bearing in mind he can speak baby and horse and all these other things. But in a way, it does distance him from Cass a bit more, and makes him more alienated, I suppose, more remote. I suppose as well that kind of allows Cass to be more in charge and lead more because she's superior to the Doctor because he can't understand what she's saying and everything has to go through Lunn. The prompt cards are a great idea. Very, very funny. There are some fantastic references for fans, like the one about Aberdeen, which obviously links back to Sarah Jane, but also some really funny blink and you'll miss it phrases. Another original move that I noticed was to have the Doctor and Clara go back to the TARDIS, halfway through. And this allows us really to pause for a bit and explore Clara's attitude, which has been more developed throughout the first act of this episode. There was a kind of hint of it in the opener, but it seems much more full on in Under the Lake. I don't know if there are meant to be more stories that have happened since The Witch is Familiar, but Clara definitely seems much more reckless in this story. And I think it's important that the Doctor addresses this early on in the series, because obviously, like I said already, it foreshadows Face the Raven, particularly the bit about the duty of care, which the Doctor again repeats in Face the Raven. And interestingly, I believe that's what Clara said about the children in the Forest of the Night. I know the less we speak about that, the better, but still, it's interesting how that links into this episode, and then Clara's death. It's almost like Clara's duty of care has gone out the window, or at least she does care for other people, but doesn't really care for herself enough, and puts herself in dangerous positions and in dangerous situations without thinking. As I said already, it's an interesting choice to have Pritchard killed off first, who is obviously the character that we hate the most. But I had a little bit of a think about this, and obviously he is kind of reincarnated as a ghost. So I was wondering, does that make him even more evil and scary and unlikable? I suppose what you've got to think as well is that none of the other crew members could have been killed off this early, because we like them too much. Even in these first 20 minutes, I think we can really relate to these characters, and turning one of them into a ghost would have been a bad move, I think. So I think I'm probably right in thinking that it was Pritchard that was killed, just to make him even more scary, and because he'd already been acting like an idiot already, so turning him into a ghost kind of develops that and makes him even more unlikable, I think. I thought that isolating the ghosts and the crew members in the drum without any means of escape, because obviously the escape capsule, or whatever it is that they're sending down, is sent back by the Doctor, because obviously he can't have the ghosts get to the surface. So I thought isolating them down there really added to the atmosphere and made it a lot more scary, because they can't escape at all apart from the TARDIS. That's the only means of escape that they've got still on board. The scene where they capture the ghosts is super creepy. It's very, very horror movie-esque. And I also really like the soundtrack at this point. It kind of starts off in the episode quite subtle, quite quiet, but still very spooky. And I think as it progresses, it becomes even louder and more bombastic and tense, I think. I thought the plan to trap the ghosts was very well thought through by both the crew, but also Toby Whithouse, who wrote the episode, because obviously they can't get in or out the Faraday cage, so trapping them in there contains them for good. I like how the sonic sunglasses were used in this story to make the holograms, which of course foreshadow how the Doctor will create a hologram of himself to make his ghost in the next story. And I found that quite clever how it was put in this early when they trap the ghosts, because there's a hologram of Clara already in the Faraday cage to lure them there. So it proves that the sonic sunglasses can make holograms to pose as humans or ghosts, and kind of sets up the whole thing with the Doctor's ghost in the next story. I thought the direction in the scene with Lunn being trapped is excellent. I mean, first of all, we see Pritchard's ghost coming up to him, and he's really close and intimate. And then we just see the spanner, or whatever he's holding, drop. And the next shot is of him just walking out. I thought the way it was cut quite quickly made it even more interesting, because it's quite slow up to that point. He's coming closer and closer to Lunn, and you think he's going to strike him or something, and then you just see him walk out. I think it emphasises it more. There's a lot more impact in that scene. The Doctor's explanation of the Dark, the Sword, the Forsaken, and the Temple is really engaging and interesting, both to the crew members and the viewer watching. Likewise, his realisation that the ghosts are not a natural phenomenon is also handled very well. I think he gets quite excited when he realises they could actually be real-life ghosts, in inverted commas. But obviously they're not going to be. Obviously there's going to be some kind of science fiction twist. I think he's genuinely disappointed when he realises that they were engineered by someone, and that they were killed deliberately to make these beacons to draw people to the planet. Because at that point, you start to realise that there's someone else behind this. Some kind of villain that's doing it for his own good, which is obviously developed in the next story, and it becomes a Fisher King. Another brilliant quote from the 12th Doctor: "Surely being around me makes you clever by osmosis." I found that one very humorous, particularly as I studied osmosis for my biology GCSE. One thing that occurred to me on this rewatch is that it's interesting to kind of consider that if the Doctor had stayed and not gone back in time to before the flood in part 2 of this two-parter, the bootstrap paradox would never have even happened. It would have kind of got really messed up, because obviously I suppose it's the Doctor's curiosity at the end of Under the Lake which fuels him and propels him to go back in time and find out what happened before the valley was flooded, but in doing that, he then causes the events of Under the Lake to happen. Now obviously I will touch on this a lot more next week, because that's the kind of theme and the resolution of the two-parter really. But it's just interesting to think that in a way, the Doctor is kind of responsible for this whole cycle, this whole bootstrap paradox. But what I did find interesting about this is that in some stories, the Doctor and companion just turn up and don't really do much, and then the story's over. But one that springs to mind for me is Planet of the Ood. The Doctor and Donna turn up and don't really do much, and it's the Ood that save the day really, and the friends of the Ood and everybody like that, Ood Sigma as well. Therefore, I don't think ever before really, the Doctor has got so involved in this story, because obviously he's integral to this bootstrap paradox cycle. The future Doctor makes the whole thing happen for the early Doctor to experience. So yeah, he's responsible for the whole setup, I suppose. The flooding of the base is just wonderful. I love how it separates the Doctor and Clara, right at the point when they need to go back together to before the flood, to work together to discover what happened. Because they are a team after all. I think it was a really clever move to isolate them. It really is the icing on the cake, and visually the flooding of the base looks wonderful. I really don't think they could have done it much better, and having all that real water on set as opposed to CGI just works so well. I think overall really, the climax to part 1 is really full on and exciting, because obviously after this we get the revelation about the Doctor's ghost, which is another thing that's thrown into the mix, another thing for the viewer to think about. I think generally the first 40 minutes of the episode are quite slow. They do help to set things up immensely, but then the last 5 minutes is really full on. A lot happens, there's a lot for the viewer to think about and take in, and I think that works really well. You know, kind of packing all these punches, it's very impactful as an ending. And the inclusion of the Doctor's ghost really kind of makes you think, how will he get out of this one? Yes, I did see it coming on initial watch when Clara turns around and they're all going, oh, there's a new ghost. And they're saying, oh, it's not Pritchard, it's not the other guy. Who is it? But I still think it works tremendously well in setting up before the flood and making you really think about how this whole situation is going to be resolved. Just one last point before we finish, which it might just occur to me, I'm not sure. But I've always thought that O'Donnell looks really different in the TARDIS scene. Obviously she's wearing a coat and a scarf I think as well, and not her cap which she had on in the base, but her makeup and face just seems to look much more lifeless I think. I don't know if this is just me, but that's always kind of annoyed me, and I'm not really sure why she looks so different, because Bennett doesn't look different. He's just wearing his same clothes and a scarf as well I think, and the Doctor looks exactly the same of course, but that's always annoyed me. It's just a funny nitpick, really. Anyway, overall, I'd probably give Under the Lake a 9 out of 10. It really is a very good episode of Doctor Who. It's got everything going for it. It's got relatable characters, a great, very atmospheric setting, and the whole tone is just very chilling. Very much like a horror movie. And it just feels like it's got that kind of movie scale. The stakes are really high, and by the end of it you're thinking, how are the Doctor and Clara going to get out of this one? You know, there's so much going on. So much danger, and I think that's what makes it so enjoyable for me. So that's what I think, but now it's time to read some of your comments. Now my first one today is from the Black Archive, and it's a comment from my previous video, my previous retrospective review. Under the Lake is a great story, kickstarting the new series in my opinion. The opener was good, but this was a fun romp of a story. Adrenaline is pumping at the end, with water gushing everywhere, and the ghosts are chilling. 7 out of 10. Yeah, I couldn't agree more really. There's such a high level of danger, and I think in many ways actually it feels a lot like classic Doctor Who. It's got that essence of Doctor Who that I can't quite explain or describe. I think also it compares to the opener, you know, it stands up on its own 2 feet. It's not like they're saying, here's a massive scale opener, but now we're going to go to something much smaller and calmer. This story is just as good as any opener or finale, and I think really that's what makes Series 9 so strong overall. Each story is such an epic scale, and each story stands upon its own 2 feet, and has a place in the series, and does something for the series. Rebel Hoovian says, Under the Lake is my second favourite episode of the series, and the humour, action and tone to the whole episode is amazing. Again, I couldn't really agree more. I think it's important to note as well the humour. There is a lot of humour in this story. There's some subtle stuff, some one-liners from the 12th Doctor, and I think that's quite important in a dark story. You know, it could have got quite carried away and a bit too dark, but the 12th Doctor is there with those funny lines to lighten the tone a little bit. So yes, I completely agree with that. My next one is from Jack Colgan, who says, exceptional execution, pardon the pun, of the ghosts, how they looked, walked, moved, etc. Also, good reuse of generic corridors without it seeming obvious. Basically, visually brilliant. Again, another comment that I agree with. It is such a visual episode, particularly at the climax with the water gushing out. It's just beautiful, and it looks so believable and so real. It's not like CGI water or something. It's real water in a real set, which makes it feel really dangerous. Jack has also written some bullet points for me, a little thesis if you like, which I'm going to look at in more detail in next week's retrospective review. It's got lots of comments on the whole two-parter, which I completely agree with, but I think I'm going to save it for next week, just so I can elaborate on what I think of the whole two-parter a bit more in this section of next week's review. Isaac Dakin says, a spooky underwater-based episode that drips with atmosphere and good supporting characters. That's such a great way of describing it, such a good metaphor, dripping with atmosphere like the water in the base itself. And of course, I agree completely with what you're saying, not going to argue with it at all. And to be honest, the remaining comments I got this week are all along the same lines really. I got nothing but praise for Under the Lake, which I kind of found surprising, because I didn't really realise quite how popular this story is. Other comments mentioned the ghosts, the concept of the ghosts, and the setting, and the cliffhanger as well, and the soundtrack. I think it's interesting about the cliffhanger, because I thought initially it was quite predictable. I still think it works though, but it's still interesting to see so many people saying how much they loved the cliffhanger. I suppose yes, it isn't anything too clever, and it does have that massive impact that makes you go, what? So yeah, that's probably why it's so successful. I think the episode overall, to be honest, it's so effective because it keeps you guessing, and keeps twisting and turning, and giving you these big cliffhangers and impacts that just keep you on the edge of your seat. So thanks to everyone that commented. I got loads more than I did for my previous 2 reviews, which is great. And if you haven't already, I'd love to hear what you think of Under the Lake in the comments below. Please also comment either here or on Twitter what you think of Before the Flood, so I can include them in next week's review, and I'll see you then for that. So thank you ever so much for watching, and bye for now.